Hello and welcome to Food to Go, the podcast brought to you by the New Food team in association with Merck Life Science. My name is Grace Galler and I am the assistant editor of New Food, and I will be your host for today's podcast. I'm excited to share that we are launching our next mini podcast series, but this time we're focusing on ethical sourcing. In the first part of this mini-series, Josh speaks to David McDiarmid, who's the Corporate Relations Director at Prince's, to find out how the company has committed to doing the right thing and supporting its vast supply chains. So without further ado, let's get straight into the interview.
David, thank you so much for making time and joining me on Food to Go. I know that we've spoken to Prince's and yourself about some of the great work that you do as a large F&B manufacturer and retailer, but just to give us an introduction into our audience, in a nutshell, what does Prince's do? What does it make? What does it sell?
Okay, thanks. Well, we're one of the oldest and largest food companies in the UK. Our roots actually go back to 1880. The Prince's brand itself was established in 1900. For many of those years through to kind of the 60s, we were predominantly an importer of the types of products that we still do today, and your audience will be familiar. So canned seafood, for example, but we've changed radically since then. So as we stand today, seafood is a huge part of what we do under the Prince's brand, but we're also present in a number of other categories, fruit, meat, vegetables. We are one of the UK's largest bottlers of edible oils. So we have brands such as Crisp and Dry and Mazola. We also have a large soft drinks business, which is primarily in the supply of third-party brands and retailer-owned label, and a big Italian products division with our tomatoes business in Italy. And as we stand today, we, as opposed to being an importer, across our 11 sites, I think the latest figures are that we make around about 85% of what we sell. So there's still some import element, which is due to climate and nature. You know, tuna doesn't swim around the United Kingdom, and our climate is not quite good for growing tropical fruits yet. But we make an awful lot of what we do ourselves across 7 sites in the UK, 1 in Italy, 2 in Mauritius, and 1 in Poland.
Thank you very much for that introduction, David. It's fair to say that Prince has got quite a lot of fingers in quite a lot of pies. In terms of those supply chains, which I'm sure are very, very complex, which parts do you think could be vulnerable to unethical actors, whether that's when it comes to sourcing or perhaps adulteration along the way?
Well, we would take a view of quite a few of them. If we look at our business, we've got something in the region, if you take some of the imported products and then also raw materials, we've got around about 592 different suppliers supplying us with, sometimes it could be finished goods and others it's just, raw materials, which may be, beans, pulses, or theoretically salt and spices. And on top of that, packaging as well. That's coming from around about 50 countries. So it's clear that we've got a very large global supply chain, quite complex, quite extensive. And we would consider pretty much everything within the food supply chain to be reasonably high risk. That's our start point. By the nature of food supply chains, ultimately, all of them will drill down to something being grown or something being fished. So when you are down at that level, you are into hundreds of thousands of workers. Some supply chains can be more opaque than others. Everything carries an element of risk, is our approach. But there are obviously some that jump out more than others. So for us as a business, over many years, tomatoes in Italy, we've considered a particularly high risk, and we've been very active in that arena ourselves because we have leverage there. But something like tuna as well, there are inherent risks in terms of fishing. On an industrial scale, often a lot of fishing is done on the high sea, so it's obviously a long way from land. So there are significant risks there, and then there will be other risks that might have more of a food fraud integrity element to them rather than obvious human rights risks. Because something like olive oil, which is something we're very mindful of, is something that's always a target for organised crime to try and make money through fraud. And we would take the view that if criminals are involved, somebody's getting abused along the line there. So there's a number of areas that probably speak to us as higher risk than others, but we do have a start point. And not sadly, but just recognising the world in which we live in, that everything from a food supply chain point of view carries some form of risk.
I want to get back to the excellent work I know that Prince has done in terms of ensuring ethical sourcing. But to start with, how on earth do you make those supply chains more visible? As you said, some are very opaque, some are a little bit more transparent. But where do you even start?
That's a great question. We've been on this journey for a number of years, and with greater success in some areas than others. But we've been taking a very proactive approach for quite some time, reaching out to suppliers, both direct ones and indirect ones, encouraging the direct suppliers to follow what we're doing. Not saying that we're perfect, but follow where the industry is heading and take more responsibility for your tier 2 and for your tier 3. But making it clear to our suppliers what the direction of travel is that we're going on this and what our expectation is of suppliers. So about enhancing transparency, increasing sustainability, tackling modern slavery, and probably more recently, talking to them about carbon. So this definitely isn't easy because there's a lot of cultural barriers out there to be broken down. So as a case in point, I think it was about 3 years ago that we first published our supply chain map on our website of all of our direct tier 1 suppliers. And at the time, that was just our imported suppliers. So again, sorry, a bit of internal language, but a case of fruit coming from Thailand is canned, labelled, packed, shipped over as the case of fruit that a consumer would see on a supermarket shelf. And so in areas like that, we started that approach in terms of transparency. So publishing who it is, where they are, number of workers, do they have the ability to form unions, that sort of thing. We've expanded that to all raw material suppliers and packaging suppliers. That's around about 600 now we publish. And we still encounter barriers from time to time just on that, what we would consider to be relatively basic level of detail, whether that's GDPR concerns or just general concerns of a supplier's name being in the public domain. There is a great deal of difference of approach. A lot of suppliers are, yeah, absolutely fine, not a problem, quite happy. And some would have some reservations over that, so that we know that in a lot of these areas, we have to build that trust and kind of build that capacity. So it's something we have to repeatedly go back to at sort of a general level in terms of supplier outreach and webinars. And then sometimes in specific areas, it'll be more detailed one-to-one discussions. So we're definitely on this journey in terms of encouraging that honesty and that transparency. And there's a number of other areas that we look at that we might come on to where we might do a specific project and have to have sort of conversations of, look, we don't know necessarily what we might find with this work we're going to do. We're not judging you. We're looking to find out more. We may find out things that make both of us uncomfortable. Let's not shy away from that. If we do, let's solve them. But there's definitely a bit of an education piece still going on. But I take a lot of confidence that, certainly speaking somewhat parochially from a UK perspective, most of the UK industry seems to be on this journey. So a lot of supply chains are shared. And so this message is filtering out.
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said there, David. But first of all, in terms of perhaps not knowing what you might find, do you think there's reluctance among some in the UK and elsewhere not to look? Because the harder you look, the more uncomfortable truths you might find in that supply chain. Is ignorance a little bit easier?
Yeah, it might be in some ways, but genuinely, I don't see it that way. I've never really come across any reluctance to look. I've had many conversations where there might be concerns due to resource, capability, size of projects, but not a reluctance to look. No, I've not actually come across that. I can understand that perhaps to an extent. We're all somewhat, well, not somewhat, the entire industry, was always aware of media attention, NGO attention. Nobody wants to be on the front page of a newspaper for the wrong reason, and we would share that view as well. But this is the industry that we are in. Those things theoretically can happen. But I've never come across anyone saying let's not look on the basis of you don't want to know. And it's usually capacity, resource constraints. Do we have time? Do we have budget? Other competing factors.
And the other thing I wanted just to ask you about is that relationship with those suppliers. And do you use your position as you said earlier, one of the largest F&B retailers, certainly in the UK, to leverage and influence supplier behaviour down the chain? Is there a standard that you expect to work with suppliers around the world, and do they have to meet it?
Yes, they do, and yes, we do try and use our leverage. Now, there will be mixed bags of success with that, because we will have in some supply chains huge amounts of leverage. So, thinking a little bit off the top of my head, I've mentioned Italian tomatoes before. Well, just to elaborate for your listeners on that, for our Napolina brand, we have a factory out in Italy. The farms are all, give or take, within 100 kilometres of our factory. We have an agronomy team. This is not a distant supply chain to us. The factory's there, the teams are in the farms with regularity. We have boots on the ground, and we're very large within the industry. So we do have leverage there. And then there will be other areas. So thinking a little bit off the top of my head, if I was to take, for example, orange juice coming from Brazil. I'm not sort of stating any specific concerns with orange juice from Brazil. And while we look at ourselves as we use quite a lot of orange juice in the juice that we supply to own label and also used in squash, relatively speaking, we're a drop in the ocean compared to other drinks businesses coming from those same sources, as will be multiple other companies in the UK, dozens more companies across the EU, all taken from the same source. So our leverage there as an individual company would probably be relatively small. But if we can find the right vehicle, to work collectively with retailers and competitors, and in this world, particularly in human rights, there is a great deal of pre-competitive collaboration that genuinely does go on. I mean, we're all, our sales teams and the commercial teams are all sort of rightly fighting out the battle in the commercial world, but there's an awful lot of bonhomie and getting around the table and sharing knowledge and learning that before we get to that stage. So that's quite common now in terms of human rights in supply chains. But yeah, we'll certainly use our leverage where we can, but mindful that our leverage in some chains will be minimal.
Do you think that's the answer to, I suppose, increase ethical sourcing and increase the human rights of producers in some developing countries? Is it for those large F&B manufacturers to get together and demand a certain standard, a certain framework from their suppliers and not accept anything else?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I'm if I sound hesitant, it's because we have to be aware of cultural differences, cultural sensitivities, and how does one come across as kind of a foreign interloper telling someone how to operate? So we have to have some sensitivities there. So we and pretty much all of the industry in the UK will be following, the UTI base code in terms of human rights and in terms of something like working hours. So if we get into working hours, we know we have the working time directive here. And also there is a certain number of hours, shouldn't really be more than 60 hours a week that anyone in the UK is working with regularity. There's a seasonal peaks on that. There are countries in Southeast Asia that are very much key players in supplying the UK food industry, where the working week can be legally 84 hours a week. So put yourself in the conversation, you're telling the owner of a business to fundamentally change their business and go beyond what the domestic law asks them to do. And again, you also come back to the leverage point. If, for example, in a particular supplier, we and many others constitute a huge part of their business, let's say coming into the UK, that's where we would collectively have that leverage. But if we're, 10% of that supplier's business, that's a big challenge for that supplier to fundamentally change how their business operates to suit 10% of their customer base. So we have to sort of take an approach of pragmatism, but also, I was almost going to say being evangelical. It's not that. You certainly don't want to come across as patronizing or this foreign interloper telling someone how to manage their business. But we do collectively have this expectation, certainly from the UK and Europe, where legislation is pretty much aligned on these things. And there is an element whereby we are collectively kind of leading other parts of the world in terms of expectations and what's required. But it's a long haul, and we have to be mindful of those cultural differences again. Not something that's easily done overnight. Just in the same way, to be totally transparent, I mean, if we had a UK customer, let's say a large retailer, and we supply pretty much all of them, if a large retailer in the UK asked Princes to do something that was a fundamental shift to our business here in the UK that no other customer was asking for, that's a tough one for us to consider. Well, we want to please the customer and meet them, but if we do that and it adds cost or complexity to all our other customers, that's something we'd have to mull over as to how we could land that. No different from the supplier example.
It's certainly a real challenge. It's one we've heard from multiple different large F&B companies when we've spoken to them. I just want to take in a slightly different direction, and that's price point of final product. I suppose it's fair to say that ethically sourced products, certainly in some segments of the industry, do cost more than maybe what we're used to paying for products whose sourcing is perhaps a little bit more opaque. Do you think consumers are happy to pay a little bit more for something if they think and they're reassured that everyone in the supply chain is being treated fairly and being paid a fair wage?
That's the question of our ages. I'm not sure is the honest answer to that question, because there are surveys that I see throughout a typical working year that seem to somewhat contradict each other. And we are, as a business and as an industry, massively mindful of the cost of living crisis that we have been going through and are still in this country. And that is clearly a concern for us. What we do know is that we're seeing increasingly, certainly from customers, but also for consumers, they want to know more about the ingredients in a product. They want to know more about what's going into their food and drink, and to know whether it's sustainable or not. The interesting point for me is, what would a consumer's expectation be? I would argue that a consumer's expectation is that we're all doing the right thing already. So it's kind of baked into that. However, the reality is, as we stand at the moment, that many areas of sustainability do cost more. There's no smoke and mirrors to that. It's a simple statement of fact. However, in terms of that premium that sustainability things can attract now, that's a broad church there. You could have fair trade accreditation, you could have Marine Stewardship Council, seafood or tuna, a number of other things. So while they do attract that level of premium, at the moment, our view is we've got to enhance what we do to help flatten that premium. So it's a kind of twofold. You are buying into those as a business and looking to source them because it's the right thing to do. It meets expectations of our own business, expectations of customers and consumers. But I'm not quite sure. I was going to use the phrase laws of economics. Not quite sure that's quite right. But if something that is more sustainable becomes the norm, it will flatten. So if the two examples a little bit off the top of my head on that one would be, if we take something like sustainable palm oil, RSPO certified palm oil, let's go back 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more even, there'd have been quite a premium for that. That's flattened over time. RSPO palm oil is pretty much the norm across the industry. 10 years ago, some of the more progressive retailers set policies and industry followed, and that's what we've got. A similar thing at the moment in terms of MSC certified tuna, for example. So we as a business have set a target and a commitment, but by the end of 2025, every can of Prince's brand in the UK will carry MSC logo and will be MSC certified. For a number of years, an MSC certified fishery has carried a premium over other types of tuna, or what we call responsibly sourced tuna. We are starting to see, and it's a little bit early days, but that premium starting to flatten. MSC is increasingly becoming the norm. I have to be careful. It's not the norm yet, but it's getting there. We're starting to see that premium flatten. So theoretically, as companies like us and our competitors and the retailers all raise the bar and sustainability becomes the norm, that premium should disappear. But it's something we are extremely mindful of, always very mindful of, and especially in our particular area of business. We are not in high-end luxury goods. We are in kitchen cupboard staples. It is a tight market. It is a deeply competitive space. Margins are extremely tight, and contracts can be won or lost on supplying brand or own label over very small amounts of money on paper. When you scale it up, it's bigger sums. So we have to constantly strike that balance in terms of what we're looking to do and talking to our customers about it. But I would hope over time, sustainability just becomes the norm.
I think that's a really interesting point around that curve flattening. It's not something that I've heard necessarily before.
Grace, one thing I am always in awe of is the innovation happening in our food and beverage industry.
Josh, I'm exactly the same. I'm constantly reporting on the most exciting stories, whether it's a crucial piece of food safety research or the latest developments in the world of cultured meat.
Yes, to me, cultured meat is one of the most fascinating corners of our sector, and all eyes are on it in terms of it becoming the next big thing in food. Could it be the solution to some of the greatest challenges we face?
Well, funny you should say that, Josh, because our podcast partner Merck is also watching on with a very keen eye and has a dedicated team ready to help assist the food and beverage industry with tailored support when it comes to customized cell culture media, QC and HACCP solutions, and regulatory guidance.
Yes, absolutely, Grace. And let's not forget the plant-based protein, precision fermentation, or regenerative agriculture side either. It's so important nowadays to have a multifaceted approach as an F&B manufacturer, and Merck really gets this. Like they say, we just have to change as a sector if we are to become more sustainable.
You can explore possibilities and learn more about Merck's contribution to this exciting field at www.sigmaaldrich.com/cultured meat.
Last question for you, David. You spoke a couple of years ago on a New Food event about greenwashing. It must be very difficult to be a large F&B manufacturer and do such good work and then be hit with greenwashing accusations. It's often the way that consumers react when they hear good things from big companies. How do you build that trust among your consumer base that actually Princes is doing the right thing and so many other manufacturers are as well?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, in terms of building that trust with consumers, it comes to me back about the point about traceability and transparency. That's key and that's critical. We're a long way from complete on this, but it's this kind of journey that we've been on. So, in terms of doing that, there's a number of things that we're on with at the moment and or have done for a number of years. So, in terms of the transparency, I mentioned earlier on about our supplier map that we publish, which is one thing, and I'd fully accept that's not really in front of consumers. Our customers are very happy about that, but it's really a business to business thing. But it's what we can do over and above that with consumers to start to bring to life what we're doing as a business to start to demonstrate more where our heart and our head is at, what we're here to do. I'm very conscious that that we are a sort of corporate, massive entity, but it's a corporate massive entity that's staffed by human beings that want to do the right thing. This is how we work day in, day out. I and my team and many others in the business come into work every single day thinking, how can we make things a bit better today? We genuinely do. That's what gets us in each day. So, and also it's about kind of embedding that more into other areas of the business with consumers. So on brands, for example, I mentioned about Italian tomatoes. So we've done absolutely tons of work for about 10 years in terms of supply chains in southern Italy, in terms of making improvements. And I can wax lyrical about them from a consumer point of view. A lot of this is stuff that's very difficult to talk to consumers about in, either through above the line advertising or in social media. These are complex things to talk about. So what we have done in terms of tomatoes there, we've introduced on-pack QR codes where you can scan Napolina. You can see the journey behind the product, where it comes from, links there to take you to further reading. We've done a similar thing with Prince's branded tuna in some European countries. We have on-pack QR codes there as well, in order, again, to give some confidence for the consumer in terms of the MSC chain of custody behind it, who are the vessels that we buy from, and that sort of thing. But it's fair to say there is more to do in terms of reaching consumers on that point. And I understand where consumers are coming from. I would have the same cynicism for industries that I'm not in. I would think that about banking or construction or petroleum as a consumer. I'd think, yeah, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, or something like that. So we all carry this to an extent, and we just need to keep on doing what we're doing, especially from that transparency point of view. So there's some things that we've done a bit more behind the scenes over the years that we're considering being more vocal on. So one of the key areas of building transparency is about increasing worker voice. So we've done worker voice programs with suppliers in Southeast Asia of seafood and of fruit in terms of using third-party consultants, not to do an audit. Now, audits of factories are very important, but I would consider them kind of your base, your foundation of your house, not a house, but there's no house without them. But the worker voice piece gives us the opportunity to talk directly to workers so they can feed back to us without fear of being listened in on or looked in on by their direct employers to hear any concerns. But I'm conscious that while we've done things like that and we talk to our customers about them, we haven't really made them public necessarily. We will take the actions from them and put in whatever improvement programs are needed with suppliers. And in a similar way, something we've started doing at a bigger scale, but still has perhaps the same limitation of human rights impact assessments. So we conducted our first human rights impact assessment as Princes last year in Argentina on pulses, because we sourced a number of pulses, chickpeas, cannellini beans from there for various brands. And this was an area we felt we didn't know enough about supply chain. So again, using some third-party consultant experts, and one of our team members went over to get his feet dirty, to go over there and meet the suppliers much further down the chain than we would ordinarily directly liaise with, to produce the report, to understand where there are areas that we can improve. Now, we've done that. We've published that through, the usual kind of trade media routes. We've shared that with ethical bodies in the UK, shared it with customers. But I am conscious it's not something that necessarily transpired into consumers yet. I think there's a journey, and I've overused that phrase, but we need to go on as well in terms of understanding how better to talk to consumers about this. But I made a point earlier on, which is a bit of a constant debate we have, of how much do consumers just expect everything's fine anyway? And if you're telling them that you've confirmed that it's fine, is that really news to them? So it would be lovely in a way to do a great piece of work and be celebrated for it, but that's not really what we're about. It's just about making sure that everything is fine, or everything in a chain is working as it should. But yeah, so there's a long way to go in terms of consumers, I think, and how that lands with them. But for the moment, we just have to get on perhaps a little bit more behind the scenes or more in a business-to-business environment. But that's something that we are mindful of. And sorry, and on one last point, I guess, our brands are starting to communicate more on this. So, and it's not just about on human rights. So my team's job will be to push the Princess brand, the Napolina brand, the Cross and Blackwell brand, the Crisp and Dry brand, shout more to your consumers about the recyclability of the product, or about the low carbon nature of it, or about what we've done in the supply chain. This is not a cynical thing, but we're conscious this is an asset in terms of what we do, and that we should shout more. It's not just a sort of corporate service function and embedded in a business. We need to tell customers more what we're doing to give them that reassurance. So we're getting better at that. Not perfect, and there are obviously some brands out there that exist solely almost from doing that. Someone like Tony's Chocolonely, great brand. You know, it's front and center of everything they do. Well, we're not at that stage yet, and most brands aren't. But it's something that we watch and look to try and improve all the time.
David, I've taken up far too much of your time already. Thank you so much for your honesty. You've made so many great points there. I'm sure our audience has got an awful lot to think about. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, that's my pleasure. Thanks very much.